Hi, I'm Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today we're covering an Everest climb where they fired their Sherpa at base camp and kept going anyway. Over a disagreement on oxygen, they chose control over experience and let go of the one person who really understood what could go wrong up there. One decision wiped out their safety margin, and everything went downhill from there. It was May 4th, 2016. Base camp at 17,600 feet in the Khumbu region was in a holding pattern as commercial expeditions finalized logistics, rest cycles, and summit plans ahead of the incoming weather window. Derek Allen Pruitt was a 41-year-old civil structural engineer from Houston who balanced a career in commercial construction with endurance sports, including marathons, Ironman triathlons, and a prior guided ascent of Denali. He had invested heavily in this Everest expedition, paying $68,000 through a Kathmandu-based outfitter for a full logistics package and a dedicated Sherpa arrangement. His assigned high-altitude support was Pemba Dorje Tamang, a 38-year-old Sherpa from Solikhumbu with 11 Everest summits and extensive experience working with commercial clients on the mountain. Derek's relationship with his assigned Sherpa, Pemba Dorje Tamang, had become strained during the expedition. Derek believed experienced climbers often relied too heavily on guides, and before leaving Houston, he had written publicly about wanting his Everest summit to feel earned rather than managed. Pemba, meanwhile, approached the climb the way veteran Sherpas typically did, not simply as physical support, but as someone responsible for monitoring a client's condition, judgment, and behavior at extreme altitude. Derek's previous Denali ascent had reinforced his confidence in his own decision-making, and by early May 2016, he felt prepared for Everest. After completing 2 acclimatization rotations to Camp 3 at 24,500 feet, he spent May 4th preparing for the summit push, expected within the next 3 days. During a final gear check at base camp, he and Pemba disagreed over supplemental oxygen strategy. Derek wanted to conserve oxygen by using lower flow rates than the outfitter's standard protocol. He planned to use 1 liter per minute while resting above Camp 3 and 2 liters per minute while climbing, believing it would reduce dependence on supplemental oxygen and extend his supply. The outfitter's standard system called for significantly higher flow rates, especially during the summit push, because above 24,000 feet, supplemental oxygen becomes critical to maintaining physical and mental function. Pemba advised sticking with the standard oxygen settings based on what he'd learned from 11 Everest summits. Derek felt the recommendation was overly cautious and believed it had more to do with liability than with how he was actually performing. The conversation stayed calm, but neither of them changed their position. Later that day, Derek went to the base camp manager and said he wanted to end his dedicated arrangement with Pemba. From that point on, he would rely on the team's rotating Sherpa system instead of working one-on-one support. Pemba accepted the decision without argument and returned to his tent. It didn't really look like much in the moment, but that was the point where the dynamic between them basically stopped being recoverable. What Derek removed, though, was the one person on the mountain who had spent weeks learning how he moved, breathed, reacted to altitude, and showed signs of fatigue, details that become increasingly important higher on Everest, where small changes in judgment or condition are often the first indicators that something is beginning to go wrong. May 5th was scheduled as a rest day before the summit push. Climbers at base camp spent the day eating, hydrating, checking equipment, and conserving energy while waiting for the weather window to open. Derek wrote a short blog post describing base camp life and briefly mentioned the change in support structure, saying he felt strong and ready for the climb ahead. After dismissing his dedicated Sherpa, Derek was reassigned to a rotating support system under Nima Gyeljen, a 29-year-old Sherpa with prior Everest experience, but no history as a primary one-on-one summit support guide. Unlike Pemba, Nima would be responsible for multiple clients during the ascent, dividing his attention across the group. That night, Derek's cough worsened. He didn't think much of it at the time. Most people don't up there. In a private journal entry, he noted that it had become more productive, bringing up small amounts of mucus rather than remaining dry, like the common Khumbu cough many climbers develop at altitude. He assumed it was caused by the cold, dry air and took ibuprofen before trying to sleep. Early symptoms of high-altitude pulmonary edema can closely resemble ordinary altitude coughs, especially in the beginning stages. Derek understood the condition academically from his research, but he did not interpret his own symptoms as a warning sign. He fell asleep shortly after midnight. In the early hours of May 6th, the summit push began with the team crossing the Khumbu icefall during the coldest period of the night, when the unstable glacier was considered least likely to collapse. Derek moved through the icefall slower than expected, gradually falling behind the group's lead climbers. The delay was not initially considered serious, though several small problems added time during the ascent, including a dead headlamp battery that forced him to switch to a backup light. Nima stayed near him for much of the climb, while also helping manage another client in the rotation. Derek reached Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, nearly an hour behind the front of the group. He described the climb as physically heavy but manageable, and believed the terrain higher on the mountain would suit him better. The stretch to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet was where other climbers started noticing things weren't quite right. Derek was stopping a lot during the traverse across the western CWM and moving way slower than the rest of the group had planned for. At one point, Nima even offered to take some weight off his pack, but Derek turned it down. You see that kind of refusal a lot on Everest. People don't want to feel like they're falling behind, even when they clearly are. He finally made it into Camp 2 late in the day, pretty wiped out, but still set on pushing forward. That's usually where things start slipping without anyone really calling it out directly. That evening, Derek barely ate and his cough worsened further, producing more mucus instead of remaining dry. Appetite loss and coughing were common at altitude, and Derek treated both as normal effects of the climb. He did not report the worsening symptoms to Nima or the lead guide before going to sleep. May 7th brought the weather window confirmation. The forecasting services had held. Surface winds at Camp 4 were dropping on schedule, and the window for a summit push was opening. The group would push from Camp 2 to Camp 3, a gain of approximately 3,200 feet up the Lhotse face, a vast, exposed slope of blue ice and fixed rope, and then continue overnight toward Camp 4 and the summit. Above 23,000 feet, the human body enters a physiological range for which it was not designed to remain. Every system is working harder and accomplishing less. Cognition slows. Coordination degrades. The body's ability to sense and respond to pain and cold diminishes in ways that are neurological rather than volitional. The climber is not choosing to feel less. The brain is simply no longer reliably processing the signals. Supplemental oxygen helps, and acclimatization helps too, but only to a point. Nothing really fully fixes what happens up there. That's why it's called the death zone, and why all those careful calculations made lower on the mountain about oxygen, pace, and safety margins have to be right from the start. Above 23,000 feet, Derek's pace dropped to roughly half that of the other clients. While climbing the steep ice of the Lhotse face, he needed increasingly long rest periods between movements and frequently fell behind the group. Because Nema was also assisting another struggling client, Derek spent long stretches effectively climbing alone on the fixed ropes. At approximately 23,800 feet, Derek vomited while attached to the safety line. He rested for several minutes, drank water, and continued upward. Nausea at extreme altitude was not uncommon by itself, but combined with his worsening cough, slowing pace, and growing exhaustion, it formed part of a larger pattern of physiological decline that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He reached Camp 3 at 24,500 feet, well behind the lead climbers, arriving more than 2 hours after the front of the group had already settled into camp. At that altitude, even a small gap in timing starts to matter more than it should. The outfitter's high-altitude medic, positioned at Camp 2, conducted a brief radio check with climbers at Camp 3. Derek's blood oxygen saturation, the percentage of hemoglobin in the bloodstream carrying oxygen, a metric that can be measured with a fingerclip pulse oximeter, was recorded at 68%, the acceptable minimum threshold above which most high-altitude medical authorities consider continued ascent safe is typically cited at 75% or above. A reading of 68% at rest at 24,500 feet is below that threshold. It is the kind of number that, in a medical context below 14,000 feet, would prompt immediate clinical evaluation. The medic relayed concern via radio to the lead guide. The lead guide radioed Derek directly. Derek, responding on his handset from inside his tent at Camp 3, stated that he felt tired but functional and that he intended to push to Camp 4 with the group. His voice, by the account of the lead guide relayed later to the outfitter's review team, was coherent. He was not incoherent. He was capable of articulating a position and defending it. This is not the same as being capable of accurately assessing one's own physiological status. At 24,500 feet, with with a blood oxygen saturation of 68%. But in the absence of a protocol that made descent mandatory at that reading, the lead guide logged the number, noted Derek's stated intention, and deferred. The log entry, the saturation reading, the radio exchange. The decision to defer was later identified as a documentation gap by the post-incident review, not because logging was wrong, but because the outfitter's protocol did not specify what action was required when a specific threshold was crossed, only that readings should be recorded. The distinction between recording a problem and responding to it was left to individual judgment in the field. In this case, individual judgment deferred to the client. The group departed Camp 3 well after midnight on May 7th for the overnight push to Camp 4 on the South Kernel. This section, up the upper Lhotse face and across the Geneva Spur to the flat exposed plateau at roughly 26,000 feet, is among the most physically demanding segments of the Southeast Ridge route. Above this point, descent becomes increasingly difficult as the South Col has no direct exit except the route used for ascent, which is already far below. Derek began the climb on a 2-liter per minute oxygen flow and was slower than all other clients from the outset. Nima had been reassigned to him following concerns raised at Camp 3, but was also managing a rope cache task for the summit push, dividing his attention and limiting continuous monitoring. The team progressed through the darkness in a staggered line of headlamps, with Derek consistently at the rear and the gap between him and the lead climbers steadily increasing. He reached Camp 4 on the morning of May 8th, well after the faster climbers had already arrived and settled in. That delay mattered more than it seemed at first. Oxygen isn't just about how much you carry, but how long you're running it for. Because Derek took longer getting up, he'd already burned through more of his supply before the summit push had even started. When they checked his remaining oxygen at Camp 4, he was down to about 60% of what had been planned for the climb, less than what the standard expedition setup was meant to safely cover for a summit attempt. The summit push from Camp 4 is typically calculated as 4 to 6 hours of climbing to the summit and 3 to 4 hours of descent, plus buffer. In standard outfitter protocol, running oxygen at the prescribed 3 to 4 liters per minute during climbing, the supply margin is designed to cover the full round trip with a safety reserve. At 60% of planned supply, the math was tight. At the reduced flow rate Derek intended to run, 1.5 liters per minute, the compromised figure he had calculated at Camp 4, the math could, on paper, be made to work. Paper, at 26,000 feet, is an abstraction. The body performing the calculation is not. Nima radioed the lead guide at Camp 4 to flag the oxygen situation. The lead guide told Derek to think carefully about his options. Derek went over it himself, checked the numbers, and still said he was going for the summit. The decision was recorded, and no one stepped in to override it. No one really tried to shut it down at that point. It was more like everyone just accepted it and moved on. He rested through the day at Camp 4. Sleep at the South Col is rarely restorative. The elevation, the noise of wind against tent fabric, the difficulty of eating and drinking in the confined cold, and the pervasive awareness of what comes next combine to produce rest that is more accurately described as horizontal waiting. Derek dozed intermittently. His cough was present throughout. He forced himself to drink water and eat a partial meal of energy food that had been carried up by the collective Sherpa team. The camp was populated by climbers from at least 3 different commercial operations, all converging on the same summit window, all running similar calculations about oxygen, weather, and time. The temperature at the South Col overnight was approximately minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface. Wind chill from the prevailing winds pushed the effective temperature lower and into dirt to a range that, with full protection, a properly layered climber can endure, but that becomes rapidly lethal the moment insulation is compromised, consciousness dims, or the body's ability to generate heat is overwhelmed. At 10:30 p.m. on May 8th, Derek Pruitt departed Camp 4 with the main group for the summit push. He was carrying his remaining oxygen, his personal emergency supplies, his handset radio, and the specific knowledge that his margin was narrower than the outfitter's plan had been designed to accommodate. He was also, by the physiological accounting that would be reconstructed later, almost certainly in the early to middle stages of high-altitude cerebral edema, the accumulation of excess fluid in the brain tissue that is the altitude illness, counterpart to what his lungs may also have been developing. HACE, as it is abbreviated in the medical literature, does not announce itself cleanly. Its early presentation is fatigue, headache, and cognitive slowing. all of which are at 26,000 feet, indistinguishable from normal altitude response until they are not. Its progression is variable, but can be rapid. Its defining feature, from a decision-making standpoint, is that the organ responsible for recognizing the problem is the organ the problem is affecting. He knew the route from his research. He knew the landmarks, the balcony at 27,600 feet, the south summit, the Hillary Step, or what remained of it following the 2015 earthquake, which had altered the feature somewhat, and then the summit ridge to the top. He had studied photographs and diagrams. He had read accounts. He had, by any reasonable definition of pre-climb preparation, done what a serious amateur could do without setting foot on the mountain. Within 90 minutes of departing Camp 4, above the balcony, Derek was the last climber in the line. Nima Gaeljan stayed with him. This is worth noting plainly because it matters. Nima, a 29-year-old Sherpa with no obligation, under a personal contract and every practical justification to pace with the main group, stayed with Derek. He shortened his own pace to match Derek's. He positioned himself on the fixed rope within a visible distance below Derek, which is the standard monitoring position for a support Sherpa. He watched. The other clients and their Sherpas were already 25 to 40 minutes ahead and still moving upward. The summit was above them. The night was clear, which in the death zone means something very different. Cold, still, and dark in a way most people never really experience. It's the kind of darkness where the only real light is your headlamp, and the stars overhead feel close, sharp, and almost harsh rather than beautiful. At approximately 28,200 feet, well above the balcony, below the south summit, at an elevation where the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is approximately 1/3 of sea level, Derek's regulator indicated low oxygen. He had been climbing for 3 hours and 20 minutes. His pace in the final hour had been 5 to 8 steps before stopping to rest. These were not strategic rest stops. They were the kind of stops the body takes when it is no longer negotiating with the climber about whether to stop. Nima climbed up to Derek's position and switched him to the emergency half canister he had been carrying. That's the kind of thing you don't really plan on using like this. The emergency supply was not a full oxygen cylinder, but a contingency reserve intended to bridge short-term gaps, not support a summit push. The summit lay approximately 650 vertical feet above their position. In the death zone, vertical gain cannot be measured against normal climbing conditions. At sea level, 650 feet of ascent might take 30 to 45 minutes on moderate terrain. At nearly 28,200 feet, with a pace reduced to 5 to 8 steps between rest stops and oxygen flowing from a partial reserve, that same distance translated into hours of effort that could not be safely sustained with the remaining supply. Shortly afterward, at an estimated elevation of 28,250 feet on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest, Derek Allen Pruitt stopped moving forward. From here on, it wasn't really about progress anymore. Nima, positioned on the fixed rope approximately 15 feet below Derek, saw it happen. Derek did not fall. He did not slip. He sat down, or rather, his body settled sideways against the slope in the way that a person sits when sitting is no longer a decision, but a consequence. Nima climbed up to him. Derek was breathing. He did not respond to Nima's voice. He did not respond to a firm touch on the shoulder. His oxygen mask was in place, but when Nima checked the regulator, it was reading empty. The emergency canister had been exhausted. Derek's gloves were partially removed. His right glove was off entirely. His left was pulled halfway down his hand. In the conditions present at that moment, approximately minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, effective wind chill, darkness, wind running at the low end of the forecast range. Bare skin at altitude loses heat at a rate that produces tissue damage within minutes, and life-threatening hypothermia within a range that depends on individual factors, none of which favor a man already compromised by hypoxia and cerebral edema. The removal of gloves in those conditions was not purposeful. It is a recognized behavioral presentation, documented in both hypothermia and hypoxic impairment literature, in which the body's confused thermoregulatory signaling produces the paradoxical sensation of warmth at the moment the body is most critically cold. The person removing the gloves does not experience it as a symptom. They experience it as relief. Nima radioed Base Camp and Camp 4 simultaneously. The first radio contact was logged shortly after the situation developed at Camp 3. He reported an unresponsive climber at approximately 28,250 feet, oxygen depleted, with signs of altered mental status. His voice on the transmission, later reviewed from the radiolog, remained steady and controlled. The lead guide at Camp 4 began organizing a response immediately. 2 Sherpas who were staged at Camp 4 and had not yet begun their own summit push began preparing to ascend with additional oxygen canisters. At the elevation involved and the pace achievable with the load they were carrying, their estimated arrival at Derek's position was 90 to 120 minutes. That window, into an hour and a half to 2 hours, was the operational reality of rescue at 28,000 feet. There is no faster option. Helicopters cannot operate at that altitude. There is no vertical evacuation. There are only people climbing with oxygen toward a fixed point on a ridge in the dark. Over the next 40 minutes, Nima maintained contact with Derek. Derek regained partial consciousness twice, brief returns, each lasting less than a minute, during which he was present in the sense of having open eyes and some response to stimulation, but not present in any communicative sense. He didn't speak clearly during either moment. He came back around. Nima gave him oxygen from his own supply during that time, even though it meant cutting into his own safety margin. He didn't hesitate, just did it. Soon afterward, Derek lost consciousness fully and did not regain it. His breathing, which had been shallow for the previous 30 minutes, became irregular in the specific way breathing at extreme altitude becomes irregular. Longer gaps between inhalations, each breath shallower than the last, the rhythm gradually losing whatever consistency it had retained. Nima stayed with him on the fixed rope, maintained radio contact with Camp 4, and continued reporting what he was observing. Roughly an hour later, 2 Sherpas from Camp 4, Dawa Chering, 34, and Kelsang Dorje, 27, both with multiple prior Everest summits, reached Derek's position on the southeast ridge. The effective wind, chill at the time, was approximately minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time they arrived, Derek no longer had a detectable pulse. All 3 Sherpas, Nima, Dawa, and Kelsang, worked in rotating pairs for approximately 20 minutes, attempting resuscitation. At 28,250 feet, without mechanical resuscitation equipment and in conditions capable of causing frostbite in exposed skin within minutes, the physical limitations on rescue were severe. Eventually, the resuscitation effort was discontinued. The 3 Sherpas began their descent. Nothing really gets said on the way down. Everyone's just focused on getting back. Derek Allen Pruitt's body remained on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest. The terrain and elevation made recovery non-viable. It was not attempted. The expedition's base camp management notified U.S. authorities on May 9, 2016, and Derek's family in Texas was informed shortly afterward. Because his body remained unrecoverable at extreme altitude, no autopsy was performed. The official incident report concluded that he died from acute altitude illness and severe hypoxia after his oxygen supply became critically insufficient during the summit push. An internal post-incident review later identified 3 major contributing factors. The first was Derek's decision to dismiss his dedicated Sherpa, removing the one person most familiar with his physical condition and behavior at altitude. The second was the failure to enforce a descent after his oxygen saturation levels dropped dangerously low at Camp 3. The third was Derek's unauthorized reduction of his supplemental oxygen flow rates, which significantly reduced his safety margin during the climb. No legal action followed the incident. The next season, the expedition company changed its contracts so that climbers now had to sign a written agreement if they wanted to change the standard oxygen settings before or during the climb.